I'm really happy to be here and to see all your faces, to see some familiar faces and lots of new faces. And I'm really happy to be here and to get to know you a bit and to be here on this beautiful day. Apparently at home in Sudbury, it's quite overcast and dreary, so I'm happy to be here in the sunshine. So I'm Jen, and I'm a Haudenosaunee woman with, I identify as a Haudenosaunee woman who has mixed ancestry. So I have my status card, so I have mixed ancestry both from settler ancestors as well as Haudenosaunee ancestors. Identity is a complicated thing. My status card says that I'm from the Upper Cayuga Nation. My family says we're from the Mohawk Nation because we follow our maternal lines. And that's not the way that the register system with the government works. But what I do know is that I am Mohawk, that I am Wolf Clan, and I'm a mother of two and a granddaughter of 4 living grandparents. And I'm really honored to be in that circle and to have been able to grow in that circle and to be able to share some things with you. I wanted to also acknowledge the opening and the territory. I'm really honored to be on this territory and to be learning. This is only the second time I've been here, I think. So I'm really happy to do that, to acknowledge the organizers and to acknowledge all of you, Indigenous faculty, students, the broader Indigenous community at this university. And I think also acknowledging those sort of teachers we've had in our past and who have come before us, people maybe I don't even know, those academic elders and ancestors who have sort of pushed down the snow in a path to make it easier for us to walk and to be here in these academic spaces sharing Indigenous knowledges. As part of that, I want to acknowledge this line of Mohawk women in my family. So I'm Jen, and I come from the waters of Julia Canlish, who comes from the waters of Margaret Londo. That's my grandmother there in the purple, beautiful woman, who comes from the waters of Helen Marcella Newhouse. Got to add my daughter to this. It keeps going. But what I want to share today is thoughts on Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous research sovereignty. So a lot of my own research program as an epidemiologist focuses on aging, dementia, so I have a lot to say around that. But today, I'm going to talk a little bit differently and less about sort of research findings related to experiences of aging and experiences with dementia and culturally safe dementia care and things like that, which I could talk about another time. Happy to come back. But today I'm going to talk more about this concept of sovereignty and how it applies to data and how it applies to research and what that means for the work that we're doing. So I want to ground our conversation in relationship to land and treaty. I want to talk a little bit about what sovereignty means in the context of data and research. And then describe for you a little bit about the work that's happening globally around this, so we can connect very closely to where we are. And we can also connect globally and learn from Indigenous nations, other places, about sovereignty and its relationship with data and research. So I'll explain a little bit about that and talk a little bit about our collective journey in Canada. There are so many paths that have been taken around Indigenous data sovereignty and research that I won't be able to do all of it justice, but just to talk a little bit about what's happening in Canada. And then think about the considerations for the use of data. So starting here with the Two-Road Treaty, this this wampum, and I'm assuming I'm talking to a room that has a familiarity with what wampum belts are in Haudenosaunee traditions, but I'll just explain that this wampum is a treaty. It's an agreement. It was an agreement made about how we would work together, how we would live together with settlers. And this treaty talks about traveling in friendship and in peace forever, as long as the grass is green, as long as the water runs downhill, and as long as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and as long as our Mother Earth will last. So this idea of traveling in our path, traveling in our vessel that has our knowledges, our language, our family structures, our governance structures, and having settlers travel in their path with their language, their family structures, their governance structures that don't interfere with one another and that can be in friendship and peace. So that's the sort of foundation of for me of thinking about what our relationship is to our governance of data, and what our perspective has to be when we think about data sovereignty. Where my family is from is Six Nations of the Grand River, and the specific agreements around Six Nations, you can see here that white tract of land that was agreed to. And then can you see that darkened point? That's where the reserve is. So if you're familiar with Southern Ontario, you'll recognize that there are cities in that white space. There's a lot of settler development in that space. These are also the kinds of conversations that ground me in my thinking about a rights-based and land-based relationship to data and sovereignty. So you can go and look at this booklet. There's actually an updated booklet now, but I like to show the map that talks about that relationship and the work that our community is doing to reestablish that agreement. But really what it's grounded in is this idea of sovereignty. This photo is taken in Australia. If you've been there and traveled to the capital city in Australia, Indigenous peoples in Australia have sort of set up on the grounds of the national parliament, where this in Canberra, and with this sign, sovereignty, and it was so meaningful to me when I saw it, because I was there meeting with people about Indigenous data sovereignty, and we were having these conversations about what this means, and it means so many different things. We can ground ourselves also in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and I've pulled out some of the articles that speak most directly to thinking about data, and just sort of in a little analysis about data and research and how this conversation is not a special interest group conversation. We're not talking about Indigenous peoples and Indigenous nations as sort of a minority population in Canada where equity requires looking at data. We're talking about a rights-based conversation. And I think that it's really important that we ground it there as Indigenous people, so that we don't lose that footing that we have, that our ancestors have given us with our treaties and our agreements, that help us to, and even the decades of work that went into the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that can help us have words to talk about why these concepts are important to us. To ground it in self-determination, the right to autonomy and self-government, the idea that we have to have decision-making institutions ourselves. And to do that, we need to have data. We need to have our own data, and we need to use our own data to be able to make informed decisions, to develop priorities and strategies and programs, to evaluate those strategies and programs. And really importantly, this last article, the right to determine our own identity or membership, for me as someone who tries to access, large data sets and help, for example, First Nation community wants to tell their own story about their experiences with diabetes, that community should be able to determine how they identify their community in the data. And it's quite challenging, actually, because in Canada, we don't have that in place in many cases, this right to determine our own identity and membership. So I wanted to just broaden a little bit to thinking about data. What is data? What am I talking about when I'm talking about Indigenous data sovereignty? And so I want to read you this quote. "The act of knowing is a collective cultural and political imperative for Indigenous peoples. Information, data, and research about our peoples collected about us, with us, or by us belongs to us and must be cared for by us. It speaks to the sacredness of data. It speaks to using data as medicine. It speaks to using data as a guide that we should be entrusted with to be able to use in responsible ways. Indigenous data includes data about our resources and environments, data about us as individuals, and data about us as nations. And that's a very broad definition of data. So I work with some Indigenous data sovereignty researchers. For all of us, it's sort of the side piece to our main research. And so this person was talking about the importance of repatriating the knowledge that the people had come to the land during the really active period of initial colonization and taken samples of worms, these worms that are part of their Indigenous knowledge, that are used in medicines, used and have stories around them. And these worms, like samples of these worms, are sitting in museums in Europe. And so repatriating that knowledge, talking about the governance of even using the genetic material in the worms. So we have to think broadly about our Indigenous knowledges and about our contemporary data that's collected about us as well. There's two conditions, I would say, for data sovereignty. One is the decolonization of data, and the second is Indigenous data governance. So I'm just going to let you think about it for a second, then I'll keep going. So decolonizing data, and then Indigenous data governance. So we have bucket loads. I don't even know, bucket loads isn't like, I don't know, huge tractor trailer loads of data that's collected about us, that our communities are collecting and submitting, that are not being used, right? That have little meaning when it comes to actually improving our own lives, improving our ability to respond when our communities need us to respond, and that don't incorporate Indigenous knowledges in the data, that don't. They're collected from a framework that's not an Indigenous framework. So decolonizing data is a really important part of data sovereignty. The other part is Indigenous data governance. So if data are collected about us, that there has to be governance in place to make sure, and it's not a power thing. Well, it is a power thing, but it's not just a power thing. It's about making sure that the stories are told from Indigenous perspectives, making sure that data aren't used to do further harm. So if we think about colonizing Indigenous data, there's these 5 Ds Maggie Walter has put forward of colonizing Indigenous data. Data are often used to tell stories of disparity, deprivation, disadvantage, dysfunction, and difference. We have to stop doing that. It classifies us as problematic. It helps justify and rationalize dispossession and marginalization. It perpetuates those narratives of dependency. So, for example, in Ontario, I work with ICES, so Jamie said the long name, which we're, so it's the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences. So we kind of say formerly known as the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences, and we're trying just to say ICES. So if I say ICES, it's the organization that holds, it's a mainstream organization that holds data from the provincial healthcare system and other systems, gathers up big, linkable, large data sets that are administrative data. So when scientists use these data, one of the frequent things they like to do is to look at regional variation, geographic variation. So what happens naturally every single time, is that you see pockets of disparity and difference in the north, in northern Ontario. Now, the population in Ontario, about half of the First Nation population, for example, lives in the south and half lives in the north. But fewer people overall live in the north. So First Nation influence on the data in the north is much stronger. So all these narratives about northern Ontario are actually narratives about what's happening with First Nation peoples. And so what's happening is that these messages of disparity, these messages of, if you tell me, please don't tell me this, but if you tell me how tired I look today, and if 5 people tell me how tired I look, I'm gonna feel really tired and like, oh my gosh, I can't believe how I can't get out of this. I can't, I better go put some makeup on or something. I'm just saying, this idea that we tell these stories that scientists using data are telling stories with the intention of shining a light on problems because they think naturally something good is going to come from that. That's false. It's false. And it just continues to tell these problematic stories, and we continue to have this narrative that Southern Ontario needs to take care of Northern Ontario. We need to take care of First Nation communities because they can't take care of themselves. So the importance of data governance, so that was the second of the 2. So the first of the 2 was decolonizing data. The second of the 2 is governance, Indigenous data governance. This is a twofold thing. So I'm not going to say I stole, I borrowed. No, she knows I use it. From a colleague in the United States, this slide. You can tell it doesn't look like my other slides. But she just explained it so well, that we have to think about 2 processes, nation rebuilding and data rebuilding, as we think about the importance of data. So in the process of building our nations and strengthening the nations. So I have a slight problem with rebuilding, but as we strengthen our nations, we strengthen our ability to govern data. As we govern data, we also need to use the data for governance. So that we're in this cycle, it's not just asserting governance on data and saying you can only use it to tell our stories our way. It's also that we need to use the data in the process of nation building. Because if we're not using it, then, that's the whole purpose of being able to use the data is to be able to build and to be able to evaluate the things we put in place, and to test out concepts and to really strengthen our knowledge and in our communities. So globally, there's movement to this. We have just launched something called GIDA, which is the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. GIDA is a word that means guide. And you can go to this website and see some of the early work that's being done. But really, I look to these amazing people who have developed these Indigenous data sovereignty networks in different places in the world. So there's a strong one in New Zealand. You can see it was established in 2015. There's one that was established in the United States in 2016, and in Australia in 2018. And these people are really guiding this and leading the international work. And then I put me and a few other people who are floating on the other part of the ocean there as other participating members who are trying to learn and trying to grow and trying to share that knowledge that we have built here. We are in what is known as Canada, we have been leaders in Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance, in putting forward principles and putting forward practices that strengthen Indigenous data governance. So we have a lot to offer globally. And I think that connecting in with this has been really important for me to expand my thinking as well beyond where we are and try and integrate other perspectives as well. So these are just some resources that you can see have been developed in addition to what's on that website. There is a whole textbook, so if you teach or if you want to do something for a project, there's a textbook on Indigenous data sovereignty that is actually a free download. And there's lots of articles that have been put out around use of data by this collective international group, and this is one of them. Most recently, the group put forward to the Research Data Alliance. So the Research Data Alliance is a global organization. They have an annual conference, and they talk about these FAIR principles, that data needs to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So we were at this conference where they're talking about FAIR principles. We were in Botswana, actually, almost a year ago, our international group. And we were listening to this conversation about data needing to be findable, data needing to be reusable. And there's a real push for open data, for data to be out there for the public to use, and that, if it's crowdsourced and things like that, that we'll be able to be innovative with the use of data. And we came together and we said, we need to also convey the message about Indigenous data sovereignty. It is, it's not just, these FAIR principles cannot stand on their own when you talk about Indigenous data. We also have to think about these principles, and someone very bright in our group came up with CARE to represent what we were talking about so that it's catchy. I don't have those skills, but this idea of that data also have to have collective benefit. They can't just be for the benefit of a government or benefit a researcher. There has to be Indigenous authority to control data. That has to be in place. There has to be a responsibility, that idea of being, that reciprocity, responsibility to one another in the use of data. That we can't just go off and tell stories using Indigenous data without Indigenous people. And that we have to think about those Indigenous ethics, that Indigenous knowledge that needs to come into the understanding of data. So we put these principles back out to that community, and you can also find a discussion paper on that on the GIDA website. In Canada, if we bring it closer here, there is a shifting landscape for Indigenous health data and research. We have come a long way, and I'm going to just talk a little bit in a second about OCAP principles and other really important steps on our path. Things are also shifting. You can see my little daughter there. She's actually 7 now, but that's she's just so cute in that picture. These other pictures, I just had to put that one because yeah, she's cute. But then the other two pictures are actually from more recently. As we were preparing, and there's other teams that have also been preparing this, but for network environments for Indigenous health research. And this is CIHR is shifting, so the big funder for health research in Canada is shifting in its way it's going to be funding and thinking about funding Indigenous health research. It's shifting in the way that it's thinking about this because it's saying researchers at universities don't have to be the center of this anymore. Communities should be at the center. So we have to think about community-centered health research. And so these were just some photos taken in the process of us developing our plans around how we might do that in Ontario. But it's been a really transformative process for researchers, Indigenous research, Indigenous scholars who are sitting in universities, for Indigenous researchers who are sitting in Indigenous organizations or in communities, for First Nations leadership, for Métis leadership. It's been transformative, and it will continue to be, and it's not easy. Those transformative things are not easy, but they are happening. And I think if we don't acknowledge that the power that comes with funding is part of Indigenous data sovereignty and research sovereignty, then we're only talking theoretical. The power that comes when you hold the money, and the power that comes when you control the agenda, the research agenda, the ethical criteria that have to be met for research to be done. That's what's transforming Indigenous health research and data. That's what's bringing the sovereignty to the conversation. So we came together, a few of us, about a year ago, to talk about how to apply Indigenous data sovereignty principles. We talked about that importance of grounding and self-determination. We talked about it's the power of data. So all of those things I was just talking about in terms of, governing data, but also using data for governance, are encapsulated in the stories that people told from a day of being together, thinking about applying Indigenous data sovereignty principles. You can see the organizations that people from different organizations came together in their, you can't see what I'm pointing at, their logos are along the top. But look at some of those big ideas: traditional data, the power of data, ethical space, self-determination, stories. These things are really important. Recently, so I work with a community-based researcher in Winnipeg on Manitoulin Island, and we were at a conference on Friday, and she said, oh, by the way, someone asked me to translate the concept of indicators. So I just want to show you what I wrote down in Snapemowin and talk about it. And I thought, this is incredible. This is incredible that our Indigenous ways of understanding indicators are becoming something that we talk about in community. And I think what's an important role for us as Indigenous scholars in academia is making space for that, is helping to create those spaces where those community researchers can say, this is what I think about health indicators. This is our community understanding of having different things that come together to tell a story about our health. And so, it was super exciting for me. I was like, oh my gosh, we have to write this up. So that's another role we play. No, I'm just kidding. But I think that we do play a role for making that space and also amplifying those voices. So really importantly, I mentioned that Canada has been a leader in thinking about Indigenous data sovereignty, and OCAP has been one of those things. Ownership, control, and access and position are First Nations data governance principles. They set a boundary. They say, First Nations own, control, access, and possess data about us. And that's, this is from the 1990s. Like, we've been doing this for a long time. And what's really important now, I think, as we move forward, is thinking both about those boundaries, but then what we do inside those boundaries. How do we ethically work with the data, not just govern the data, but use it for governance? That's where we have to go next as communities, as Indigenous scholars, as people supporting this process. Because we have established First Nations data governance in many spaces, and now we figure out how we use that data for governance. Much of the work that's happening in this area are guided by a few of the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. And I saw the amazing work that's happened in Manitoba. I just want to shout out to that. And that there's a new report on the health of First Nations people in Manitoba that apply these data sovereignty principles, that work in partnership to be able to unlock the data, to be able to show, to be able to tell the story of First Nations health by First Nations in Manitoba. And they also grounded the purpose of that work in two of these calls to action as well. So one of them is to acknowledge that the current state of Aboriginal health in Canada is the direct result of previous Canadian government policies, including residential schools. So thinking about the roots and where these things come from, the roots of these health challenges. And number 19, to establish measurable goals to identify and close the gaps in health outcomes. This is the preoccupation of my existence. This is what I do all the time. This is what I'm aiming for. And then another thing I always think about is recognizing and respecting and addressing distinct health needs of Métis, Inuit, and off-reserve Aboriginal peoples. Because sometimes in the data you can tell who's living on and off reserve, sometimes it's only on reserve, sometimes it excludes Métis and Inuit. The main thing that in my experience has been important is to think about things, so in the work that I do at ICS with the data, I work with the Métis Nation of Ontario to access and tell their access the data and tell their stories. I work with Chiefs of Ontario and other First Nations in Ontario directly, and work with Inuit organizations. It's a bit more complex because we don't have any part of our province that's in the Métis or in the Inuit homeland. So it is a bit of more complex. But these data Métis data belong to Métis. They would never sit in a report with First Nations necessarily, unless that's how the Métis and First Nations decided to present it. So just really recognizing, respecting, and thinking about those differences. I'm just going to go, so this is another thing that's guiding the thinking, but I'm just going to have to skip. So just to say that the calls for justice in the inquiry report, I always want to talk about these because we can't, I do aging research and Indigenous data sovereignty research. Sometimes it's feasible that I could say, I don't do work related to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and that is not true. And the calls for justice help to show us that these are calls for justice for all Canadians, for all governments, for everyone. Everyone has a responsibility in this space, and if you read carefully those calls for justice, you'll see yourself in them. So linked data, as I mentioned, it's happening here in Manitoba. It's happening across different First Nations regional organizations and also communities and nations and across Canada. And I just wanted to tell you quickly in our story in Ontario. So in Ontario, what happened was ICES was putting the scientists, so this is before I went there, just clarifying, but they were telling the stories. They were saying, okay, well, what if we just say, Okay, what if we look for postal codes that are on reserve? Let's do it that way. We might not even have to ask if we do it that way. And they were publishing things that said, okay, among people in First Nations postal codes, this is the injury rate, for example, just as an example. And the Chiefs of Ontario said, please stop. Please stop using our data to tell our stories. Let's work together to do it better. And so there is a resolution, a series of resolutions and agreements that went to assert that sovereignty over the data held at ICES. And now we're at the point of having several reports that have come out using the data in ethical ways. So this last thing that I just skipped over quickly is describing the process of ethical research in a diabetes research project. We've been working over a period of many years to be able to do these, to form the foundation to be able to do these kinds of reports. In a similar process, just to recognize the diversity of work, so we have the Chiefs of Ontario, but we also have smaller groups of communities that have come together, tribal councils who have come together to say we want our data, we want it at a community level, we want to do it our way. And so there's a group called Mamo Yamoan, which is translated as Everyone's Voices. Now their original name was the First Nations Center for Excellence in Epidemiology. So you can imagine how excited I was as a First Nations epidemiologist. When they changed their name to Everyone's Voices, I thought, what more beautiful a way could we express the concept of epidemiology than to say it's everyone's voices coming together, it's everyone's data coming together to tell a story. And so it's a collaborative of over 70 First Nation communities in Northern Ontario to be able to report. They started by reporting on mortality statistics, and they have a whole partnership report. They have individual reports for each tribal council or health authority, and every single one of those communities has their own report as well. And this was a really important part of this, is to have community level data wherever possible. So just to start to wrap up, some of the things to think about are that we are in many data sets. You know, we're everywhere. But it's really important to think about who's telling our stories. So if it's one of these situations, like I mentioned, some pockets of Northern Ontario, where there's a high percentage of First Nations people, it's important to involve, build relationships, collaborative. Make sure you understand the story you're telling. If there's actual Indigenous identifiers, there's no excuse for using that and reporting it without Indigenous people, without Indigenous nations guiding that work. And I often hear, and I know it's a really challenging part of my job, I think, is this idea that a lot of people want to help. I just want to help those poor people in Northern Ontario. But there's a difference between wanting to help and wanting to be a helper. It's an important conceptual difference that I was taught about from an elder, because being a helper means you listen to what, and you anticipate in a really genuine way where you can take away the roadblocks, where you can help that water flow. You can move the rocks out of the way and the water can flow more easily, versus, you know, building a tube and making the water go where you want it to go. So I think this concept of being a helper is one that's really important, and one that's important for us as Indigenous scholars working in academic institutions. Some of those key messages are that Indigenous-centered approaches to Indigenous data and research are critical. We have to honor rights, strengths, and resilience. So I didn't get into the challenge of deficit-based data when we want to be strengths-based in our approaches, but this is something we can talk about more. I'm just conscious of time. And just this idea of being humble, is humility in all of this work. And the most important message, I think, is this idea that the path is a braided path, like these rivers that go there's not just one path through that river. I put a picture of my kids because they don't go in one path either when they're walking through the forest. We just never know where they might end up. But just that no one is going in the exact same direction. We have to be patient with each other. We have to look to each other. I'm looking to Manitoba for that guidance. We can look to other places in the world for those examples in trying to find our path to Indigenous data governance and using data for governance. I want to say thank you and Yahweh.